The night I realized my husband had already decided my future without me, I was standing barefoot in our kitchen, holding a cup of tea that had gone cold in my hands, listening to him talk about our life as if I were no longer part of it. He didn't shout. He didn't threaten. He didn't even sound angry. And that was the most terrifying part. He spoke calmly, confidently, like a man explaining a business decision that had already been approved and finalized. In that moment, something inside me shifted, not broke, not cracked, but sharpened. Because betrayal doesn't always arrive screaming. Sometimes it arrives wearing the voice of someone you trusted for decades. My name is Evelyn Harper, and I was 58 years old when I understood that love, loyalty, and time invested mean nothing to someone who sees relationships as assets and people as leverage. I had been married to Richard for 34 years. 34 years of shared mortgages, shared grief, shared victories, and shared silence. We met young, built a life brick by brick, survived lean years, raised children, buried parents, and watched our reflections age together in the bathroom mirror every morning. I believed history protected me. I believed loyalty was a shield. I believed that after giving someone your youth, your energy, your unpaid labor, your emotional backbone, you earned safety. I was wrong. Richard didn't wake up one day and become a stranger. He evolved slowly, quietly, the way mold spreads behind walls, out of sight until the damage is structural. He began speaking around me instead of to me. Decisions were made for efficiency. Accounts were moved for convenience. Conversations ended with phrases like "you wouldn't understand" or "it's complicated." And because I had been trained, by marriage, by motherhood, by society, to keep the peace, I let it slide. I told myself it was stress. Age, work pressure. Men change, I said. Marriage has seasons. What I didn't realize was that while I was busy maintaining the emotional temperature of our home, Richard was quietly redrawing the blueprint. The night in the kitchen, he explained, without looking at me, that he had restructured things to protect himself. Not us, himself, the house, the savings, the future. All filtered through his name, his authority, his control. And when I asked carefully where that left me, he smiled, not cruelly but dismissively, and said, "You'll be fine. I've taken care of everything." That sentence told me everything I needed to know. Because when someone says you'll be fine without asking what you want, they've already removed you from the equation. I didn't cry that night. I didn't argue. I didn't confront him or demand explanations. I did something far more dangerous. I listened. I observed. I remembered who I was before I became convenient, agreeable, invisible. And as I stood there in the dim kitchen light, watching the man I once trusted plan a future that erased me, I made a decision that would change everything. I would not explode. I would not beg. I would not warn him. I would become quiet in a way that men like Richard never fear, until it's too late. Because when a woman like me stops reacting, stops explaining, stops pleading, it doesn't mean she's weak. It means she's calculating. The next morning, I woke before Richard, the way I always had, but this time the quiet felt different. It wasn't the familiar, tired silence of routine. It was alert, observant, almost strategic. I sat at the edge of the bed watching the slow rise and fall of his chest, this man who had slept beside me for more than 3 decades, and I tried to remember when I had last truly seen him. Not the role he played, not the husband he performed for holidays and public dinners, but the man underneath, the one capable of deciding my worth without consulting me. I realized then that I had spent years memorizing his moods, anticipating his needs, adjusting my tone and timing so life would remain smooth. And in doing so, I had trained him to believe I would always adapt, always absorb, always accept. That realization didn't hurt as much as it should have. It clarified. I moved through the house that morning like a guest in my own life, touching things differently. The dining table I refinished myself when we couldn't afford new furniture. The framed photos on the wall, vacations I planned, birthdays I organized, smiles I coached into existence. My labor was everywhere, yet my authority was nowhere. Richard came into the kitchen, kissed my cheek absent-mindedly, and asked if I'd seen his watch. The casual entitlement in his voice almost made me laugh. I handed it to him without comment, watching his reflection in the microwave door as he adjusted it on his wrist. He didn't notice my silence. Men like him rarely do. They confuse quiet with agreement, calm with consent. After he left for work, I did something I hadn't done in years. I sat down at the desk in the spare room, the one he called the junk room, and I opened a notebook. Not a journal filled with feelings, but a ledger of facts, dates, account names, property records, conversations I remembered but had dismissed at the time. Patterns I could now see clearly because I was no longer emotionally invested in defending him. I wasn't angry yet. Anger clouds judgment. What I felt was focus. The kind that comes when you finally stop hoping someone will change and start accepting who they are. I reviewed my own history with brutal honesty. I had stepped away from a promising career to support his. I had signed documents without reading them closely because we trusted each other. I had allowed my name to disappear from things that mattered because it was easier than arguing. None of that made me stupid. It made me cooperative. And cooperation, I was learning, is only safe when power is shared. What unsettled me most wasn't that Richard had done this. It was how confidently he believed I would never challenge it. That assumption told me exactly how small he thought I was. By the time the sun shifted across the floor and the house warmed, I had made another decision. I would not confront him with emotion. I would confront him with structure, with records, with foresight, with the version of myself he had never bothered to understand. I closed the notebook, made myself a fresh cup of tea, and felt something settle deep in my chest. Not rage, not sadness, but resolve. I had given Richard the best years of my life. I would not give him my ending. And if he believed this story was already written, he was about to learn a very expensive lesson. For the next several days, I played my part perfectly, not because I was weak, but because I was deliberate. I spoke softly, asked harmless questions, laughed at the right moments. I let Richard believe the balance of power was unchanged. Men who think they've won stop guarding the door. They grow careless. And Richard, in his quiet arrogance, began to loosen in ways he never had before. He took phone calls in the living room instead of stepping outside. He left emails open on his tablet, assuming I wouldn't look, or worse, wouldn't understand. He started narrating his plans out loud, not directly to me, but around me the way people talk to furniture. "I might move some things around this quarter," he said one evening, scrolling through his phone. "Just optimizing." I nodded, as if finances were a foreign language to me. Inside, I translated every word. Late at night, when the house settled and Richard's breathing grew heavy with sleep, I became someone else entirely. I moved quietly, methodically, like a woman reclaiming territory inch by inch. I logged into accounts I hadn't checked in years. Some passwords still worked, old habits die hard. Others required resets, which I requested without hesitation. I memorized account numbers, traced transfers, and followed trails the way a good investigator does, patiently without assumptions. What I found was worse than betrayal. It was preparation. Richard hadn't acted in anger or desperation. He had been planning an exit that left me legally alive but financially erased. A house placed solely in his name. A trust restructured without my signature. Assets repositioned so that if I questioned anything, he could claim confusion, not intent. I sat there in the glow of my laptop, my reflection faint in the screen, and thought about all the years I had defended him, to friends, to family, to myself. I had said things like, "That's just how he is, and he's not good with emotions, and he didn't mean it that way." I realized then how often women translate harm into tolerance, betrayal into misunderstanding. We become interpreters for men who never bother to learn our language, and suddenly the fog lifted. Richard didn't misunderstand me. He understood me perfectly. He just didn't respect me. The clarity was sharp, almost surgical. I wasn't heartbroken anymore. I wasn't even surprised. I was alert, focused, dangerous in the quiet way. I copied documents, took screenshots, backed everything up to a drive I labeled with something mundane, recipes, and tucked it into a drawer beneath old scarves. I wrote timelines, not opinions, dates, not emotions. If this ever reached a courtroom, I wouldn't sound like a wounded wife. I would sound like a woman who had done her homework. During the day, I went about my routines. grocery shopping, laundry, polite conversations with neighbors, but even those moments felt different. I was no longer performing normalcy, I was inhabiting it while planning my exit. Every small courtesy Richard took for granted became a reminder of how invisible he thought I was. And invisibility, I was learning, can be weaponized. One afternoon, as he was leaving for work, Richard paused at the door and said almost fondly, "You've been very calm lately." I smiled back, gentle and unreadable. "I've just been thinking," I replied. He nodded, satisfied, unaware that my thoughts were already 3 steps ahead of his. That night, lying awake beside him, I stared at the ceiling and imagined 2 futures. In one, I confronted him too early, too emotionally, and he twisted the narrative until I doubted myself again. In the other, I waited. I gathered. I prepared. And when the moment came, I spoke once and never had to repeat myself. I chose the second future. Because revenge, I was learning, doesn't begin with confrontation. It begins with patience. It was around that time that I stopped seeing Richard as my husband and started seeing him as a pattern. Patterns are easier to dismantle than people because they repeat themselves, because they rely on predictability. Once I understood that, everything became simpler. I noticed how he always scheduled business dinners on Thursdays, how his mood softened on days he felt in control and sharpened when something unexpected interrupted his routine. I noticed how he underestimated anyone who didn't challenge him openly, especially me, especially the woman he believed had traded ambition for comfort, intelligence for loyalty. That belief was the cornerstone of his confidence, and I let him keep it. I let him believe I was tired, uninterested, slightly out of step with the world he thought he owned. Behind that facade, I began rebuilding myself in quiet, untraceable ways. I reached out to an old colleague under the pretense of catching up, careful to keep my tone light, nostalgic. One conversation led to another. I updated a resume I hadn't touched in years, surprised by how strong it still was once stripped of apology. I researched laws, property law, marital assets, fiduciary duty, not with panic, but with curiosity. Knowledge stopped being something I deferred to others. It became something I reclaimed. Every answer I found tightened the knot of certainty inside me. Richard hadn't just been cruel, he had been sloppy, and sloppy men lose everything eventually. At home, I began to change small things. I took back control of tasks I'd quietly surrendered over the years. I handled the mail again. I insisted on sitting in on conversations that used to happen later. I asked questions, not accusatory ones, just precise ones. Questions that forced him to explain himself. I watched him adjust, watched irritation flicker across his face when I didn't back down as easily as before. But I never pushed far enough to expose myself. I was learning the rhythm of pressure and release. The art of letting someone think they are still winning while the ground shifts beneath them. One evening, Richard came home later than usual, his tie loosened, his confidence dulled around the edges. He poured himself a drink and said, almost casually, "I may need you to sign a few documents soon, just routine things." The room felt very still. I looked up from my book and met his eyes, holding the gaze a second longer than necessary. "Of course," I said calmly. "I'll read them carefully." The pause that followed was subtle, but it was there. A fracture. He laughed it off, but I saw the calculation restart behind his eyes. He had sensed something, resistance perhaps, but not enough to stop what he had set in motion. That night, after he fell asleep, I stood in the bathroom staring at my reflection. The woman looking back at me wasn't younger, wasn't suddenly different, but she was sharper, straighter, awake. I realized then that revenge wasn't about humiliating Richard or destroying him publicly. That would be too easy, too brief. What I wanted was correction. I wanted the world to realign itself so that his assumptions failed him one by one. So that every step he took relying on my silence would collapse under its own weight. I went back to bed and closed my eyes, feeling an unfamiliar calm settle over me. The kind that comes when you stop asking for fairness and start preparing for outcome. Richard was still asleep beside me, dreaming whatever small, self-assured dreams men like him have when they believe the story belongs to them. He had no idea. He was already standing inside the last chapter of his version. The turning point didn't arrive with a shout or a dramatic discovery. It arrived quietly, disguised as courtesy. One afternoon, Richard suggested we meet with his financial advisor together, a man I'd only heard about in passing, always referred to as my guy, never by name. The invitation was framed as inclusion, but I recognized it immediately for what it was: containment. He wanted me present just enough to legitimize decisions already made, just enough to nod along and later be blamed if things unraveled. I agreed without hesitation. In fact, I thanked him for including me. That gratitude softened him, reassured him. Men like Richard mistake politeness for permission. The office was sleek in the way expensive things often are: glass walls, minimalist furniture, a faint smell of citrus and ambition. The advisor shook my hand briefly, his attention already drifting back to Richard as if I were an accessory that came with the package. They spoke in shorthand, acronyms, assumptions. I listened. I asked nothing. Not yet. When documents were slid across the table, I didn't reach for a pen. I reached for my glasses. The pause that followed was almost imperceptible, but it changed the air in the room. I read every line, slowly, thoroughly. I asked one question, then another, calm, precise, impossible to dismiss without sounding evasive. The advisor cleared his throat. Richard shifted in his chair. "That's a good question," the advisor said, glancing at Richard before answering. "Good." I let that word hang. Good questions make people nervous when they're not used to being asked by someone they've underestimated. I didn't accuse. I didn't raise my voice. I simply asked about structures, signatures, timelines. I asked why certain assets were listed under new entities. I asked why my name appeared on liabilities but not on ownership. Each question peeled back another layer of Richard's confidence. I watched it happen in real time. The recalibration, the subtle panic masked as annoyance. When we left, Richard was unusually quiet. In the car, he finally said, "You don't need to worry about all that, it's complicated." I turned to him, my expression neutral. "Complicated doesn't mean inaccessible," I replied. He didn't respond. That silence told me everything. He had counted on my disinterest. He had relied on the old version of me who trusted without verifying. And now he knew that version was gone, even if he didn't yet understand what replaced her. That evening, I made a decision I had been circling for weeks. I contacted an attorney of my own, not one of his recommendations, not someone from his network, someone independent, female, unimpressed. Our first conversation was short but electric in its clarity. She asked me what I wanted, not what I feared. That distinction mattered. I told her I wanted protection, documentation, and leverage. She told me to bring everything. As I gathered my folders that night, I felt something unexpected rise in me, not vengeance, but authority. The kind that doesn't announce itself. The kind that settles into your bones and refuses to be rushed. Richard was in the living room, watching television, laughing at something trivial. I looked at him from the doorway and realized how small his world actually was, how narrow his imagination had become. He thought power was something you held over others. He had never considered that power could also be the ability to walk away with everything intact. I went to bed that night not as a wife waiting to be wronged, but as a woman preparing to correct a miscalculation. And miscalculations, I knew, always cost more than people expect, especially when they're made by someone who believes the game is already won. Once I retained my own attorney. The world shifted in ways Richard couldn't see, but I could feel it in everything. The way I walked into rooms, the way I listened without reacting, the way I stopped explaining myself. My lawyer, Elaine, didn't flatter me or dramatize my situation. She was calm, methodical, and utterly uninterested in my marriage as a story. She cared about facts, leverage, options. During our second meeting, she spread the documents across her desk and said something that stayed with me. "He didn't plan for you to wake up." That sentence reframed everything. Richard's actions weren't the work of a mastermind. They were the gamble of a man betting on my continued compliance. And now that bet was failing. Elaine explained my position clearly. Years of commingled assets, silent contributions, documented intent. The law, she said, does not favor cleverness, it favors evidence. And I had evidence, more than enough. She advised patience. Let him make the next move, she said. People reveal themselves most clearly when they think they're in control. I left her office lighter, not because the situation was resolved, but because it was now contained. Contained problems don't spiral, they conclude. At home, Richard began changing tactics. He grew attentive in ways that felt rehearsed. Compliments appeared where indifference once lived. He asked my opinion on things that had never included me before. It would have worked once. It didn't now. I watched the shift with detached curiosity, the way one watches whether change interesting but not personal. One evening over dinner he said, "We've been together a long time. We should trust each other." I set my fork down gently and met his eyes. "Trust," I said, "works best when it's mutual." The silence that followed was thick. He nodded, smiling tightly as if we had agreed on something. We hadn't. Behind the scenes, I moved pieces quietly. I opened a separate account in my own name. I secured copies of historical tax filings. I transferred personal documents to a safe location. None of it was dramatic. All of it was irreversible. Each step felt less like rebellion and more like restoration, reclaiming things that had always been mine but slowly drifted out of reach. I wasn't stealing anything. I was retrieving myself. One night, Richard asked casually, "You haven't talked to anyone about us, have you?" I looked up from my book. "Why would I?" I asked. He shrugged, pretending nonchalance, but his eyes searched my face longer than necessary. That's when I knew he was afraid not of losing me, but of losing control of the narrative. He didn't want me speaking because speech changes outcomes. Silence protects illusions. I slept deeply that night, not because things were peaceful, but because they were clear. I had crossed an invisible line from reaction to intention. Whatever came next would be on my terms, shaped by preparation rather than shock. Richard still believed this was a marriage in trouble. He had no idea it was already a case study in consequences. And the most dangerous part, for him, was that I was no longer emotional about it. I was organized. The moment Richard realized he was no longer steering the situation came subtly, the way most truths do without announcement. It was the afternoon he discovered one of his carefully arranged transfers had been paused, not reversed, not challenged, simply paused. He called from his office, his voice controlled but sharp around the edges. "There's been a delay with one of the accounts," he said. "Do you know anything about that?" I didn't rush to answer. I let the silence stretch just long enough to unsettle him. "I asked for clarification," I replied evenly. "I wanted to understand the structure before anything moved further." That was true and devastating. From that day on, the mask slipped. Not all at once, Richard was too practiced for that, but in fragments. Irritation replaced charm. Questions became accusations. His patience thinned in public and snapped in private. He began reminding me indirectly of everything he believed he'd built, everything he thought I owed him for. "You've had a good life," he said one night, packing the living room. "I provided that." I looked at him then, really looked at him, and understood how small his definition of partnership had always been. Provision, to him, meant permission. I didn't argue. I didn't defend myself. I let him talk because people reveal their worst truths when they think they're explaining themselves. Every word became part of the record, not just legally, but emotionally. I stopped seeing him as someone I needed to convince and started seeing him as someone I needed to outlast. That shift was everything. Elaine called 2 days later. "He's escalating," she said calmly, "which means he's cornered." She explained the next phase: formal separation of assets, documented intent, preemptive filing, not dramatic, strategic. Richard still believed he could pressure me into backing down. He didn't realize pressure only works on people who are afraid of losing something. I had already let go of the version of him I thought I married. At home, I packed slowly, not suitcases, but clarity. I separated what was mine, labeled what mattered, archived what proved history. I moved sentimental items first. Photographs, letters, the quiet evidence of a life lived honestly. When Richard noticed, he asked, "Are you planning to leave?" I met his gaze without flinching. "I'm planning to finish," I said. He didn't understand then. He would. The night before everything formally shifted, I stood alone in the kitchen, the house humming softly around me. I wasn't angry. I wasn't afraid. I was resolved. Richard had spent years preparing to exit with advantage. I had spent weeks preparing to exit with truth. And truth, I had learned, doesn't need to rush. It arrives exactly when it means to. By the time Richard realized this was no longer a negotiation, but a reckoning, it was already too late to change the outcome. The formal notice arrived on a Tuesday morning, delivered with the kind of neutral professionalism that strips emotion from everything it touches. Richard wasn't home when it came. He'd left early, tension riding him hard enough that he barely muttered goodbye. I opened the envelope at the kitchen counter, read every line once, then folded it neatly and placed it beside my coffee. Elaine had moved exactly when she said she would. Asset freezes where appropriate. Protective filings. A clear declaration that any further unilateral action would be documented and challenged. It wasn't an attack. It was a boundary in legal language, cold and immovable. Richard's reaction came that evening. He didn't explode, he imploded. He paced, accused, backtracked, reframed. He told me I was being manipulated. He told me I was overreacting. He told me this would destroy everything we'd built. I listened, arms folded, calm in a way that clearly terrified him. When he finally ran out of words, he asked the question that mattered most to him. "What do you want?" I answered without hesitation. "What's mine and my peace?" He stared at me as if I'd spoken another language. The following weeks were a masterclass in unmasking. Friends he'd once dismissed as irrelevant suddenly became allies he tried to enlist. Narratives shifted. Stories softened. Apologies appeared, carefully worded, conditional, designed to regain ground rather than admit fault. I didn't respond to any of it. Elaine handled communication. Silence did the rest. There is nothing more destabilizing to a manipulator than a woman who stops explaining herself. I moved out quietly, not in the middle of the night, not in a rush. I chose a small, sunlit apartment that felt like possibility rather than compromise. Each box I unpacked felt like an exhale. Richard tried once more to see me alone. I declined, not out of fear, but because there was nothing left to discuss. Closure, I learned, is not a conversation. It's a decision. The settlement came faster than he expected, faster than he deserved. Because the truth, documented and unflinching, leaves very little room to maneuver. When the final papers were signed, I didn't feel victorious. I felt complete. The kind of completion that doesn't look backward for validation. Richard lost what he thought he owned. Control, certainty, the comfort of my silence. I gained what I had almost forgotten I was entitled to. Autonomy, clarity, and the quiet power of choosing myself. And that, I realized, was the revenge he would never recover from. Life after Richard didn't arrive with fireworks or dramatic reinvention. It arrived gently, like morning light through an unfamiliar window. I began noticing things I hadn't had space to notice before. The way I slept deeper without anticipating someone else's mood. The way my thoughts moved freely without self-censorship. The way silence no longer felt like something to fill or manage. I rebuilt my routines deliberately. Morning walks without checking the time. Meals chosen because I wanted them, not because they fit someone else's schedule. Evenings spent reading, thinking, remembering who I had been before my world narrowed to accommodating another person's ambitions. People reacted in predictable ways. Some admired my calm. Others were confused by it. A few quietly distanced themselves, those who had benefited from my old habit of smoothing things over. I didn't chase anyone. I understood now that not all losses are failures. Some are corrections. Richard tried once more to reinsert himself into my orbit, an email forwarded by mistake, a message framed as concern. I didn't respond. Not because I was bitter, but because I no longer needed to prove anything. The absence of reaction was its own final statement. Professionally, doors reopened. Not because I begged for them, but because I stood differently when I knocked. I took on consulting work selectively. I said no more often than yes. I stopped apologizing for having standards. Each small act reinforced the truth I had reclaimed. My value had never been conditional. It had only been deferred. One afternoon, months later, I ran into Richard by chance. A grocery store aisle, a neutral space. He looked older, tired, smaller somehow. We exchanged polite nods, nothing more. As I walked away, I felt no surge of triumph, no lingering ache, just distance. Clean, final distance. That was when I knew the story had truly ended, not because justice had been served, but because it no longer needed to be. I went home that day and wrote one last entry in the notebook I'd kept through the ordeal. Not a list, not a strategy, just a sentence. I trusted myself, and that was enough. I closed the notebook and put it away, no longer something I needed to reference. The chapter was complete. Some people think revenge must be loud to be powerful. They're wrong. Sometimes, the strongest revenge is living well and never looking back. I don't tell this story often, and when I do, I leave out the dramatic details people expect. The shouting, the tears, the grand confrontations. Those moments existed, but they weren't what changed me. What changed me was the quiet work. The nights I chose clarity over comfort. The mornings I chose truth over habit. The steady decision to stop shrinking so someone else could feel taller. That kind of transformation doesn't announce itself. It settles in and rewrites you from the inside out. I learned that betrayal doesn't always arrive with cruelty. Sometimes it arrives wrapped in familiarity, masked as partnership, justified by convenience. And revenge doesn't always look like punishment. Sometimes it looks like refusal. The refusal to keep explaining, to keep carrying, to keep absorbing damage in the name of love. There is a strange dignity in that refusal, a kind of strength that doesn't need witnesses. Today, my life is smaller in some ways and richer in others. Fewer voices, more honesty. Less noise, more meaning. I no longer measure my worth by what I can endure or how much I give away. I measure it by how deeply I can stand in my own truth without apology. That was the lesson hidden beneath everything Richard tried to take from me. If there is one thing I carry forward, it's this. When a woman finally chooses herself, she doesn't just survive betrayal, she outgrows it. And once you outgrow something, it can never control you again. If this story spoke to you, if you've ever been underestimated or quietly betrayed, stay with us. Subscribe to Silver Reckoning Hub for more powerful, realistic stories where wisdom outlasts manipulation and quiet strength delivers the final reckoning.